We go for launch.
5.
Quiet, numbskulls, I'm broadcasting.
Anything can happen in the next half hour.
4.
My friend, we cannot keep this a secret any longer.
This whole thing is insane.
3.
Quiet, please. I am analyzing.
Where's the kaboom?
2.
There was supposed to be an earth-shattering kaboom.
1.
Greetings, my fellow galactic travelers, and welcome back to Planet 8. This is your mission commander Larry speaking to you from our hidden base. Chief Engineer Bob is here by my side as always in the command center, and circling Planet 8 in our orbital spy satellite is Reconnaissance Officer Karen. And on this episode of Planet 8, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the Walt Disney cartoon, television, movie, theme park, everything and anything that surrounds Halloween and Walt Disney, or as some of us affectionately call him, Uncle Walt. We are very, very fortunate to have special guests with us today from the official Walt Disney Family Museum podcast, Bree Bertolaccini and Chris Mullens. Guys, thank you very much for joining us on Planet 8 today.
Of course, thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Hey, straight away, I'm a huge Walt Disney fan, and Bob and Karen and I have been watching, Trick or Treat cartoon with Huey, Dewey, and Louie, Ghosts. I almost went to Escape from Witch Mountain because I was just wanting to get into all the minutia of what Walt put out. Why don't you guys give us a little bit of background of what you do at the Walt Disney Family Museum and the podcast, and we'll get into more detail at the end of the show, but just give us a quick rundown if you don't mind.
Yeah, well, my name is Bree, and I co-host the WDFM, the official Walt Disney Family Museum podcast with Chris Miller. When I'm not doing that, I'm the marketing manager at the Walt Disney Family Museum and kind of do a lot of just more historical research and making that into kind of digital content. So the kind of fun stuff with that. And I've been with the museum for almost 7 years now. Did a little stint in Walt Disney World with Chris, actually. We both did the Disney College program, and I worked on the Kilimanjaro safaris and Animal Kingdom. So very into, I love anything Walt Disney. So yeah. Chris, what about you?
Well, I have a very similar story. I started at the museum back in 2014, working on the floor as a guest experience associate. I was selling tickets, giving tours and the talks in the galleries. Loved that. And I was actually approached by Bree after our college program experience to help with writing for the blog, which, I love Disney history. I love telling stories about Walt and the things that he created. So I jumped at the chance. And then, a couple years down the line, Bree needed some more help with the marketing department of the museum, and I jumped at the chance, and I've been doing that ever since, doing things like co-hosting the podcast with Bree, helping to run the museum blog, sending out our communications to members and other subscribers, as well as putting things on our website and on our calendar, letting people know all the fun stuff that we have going on throughout the year.
Awesome. Well, again, guys, thank you. And I've been to the museum on a number of occasions, and if anyone has an opportunity to visit them, I highly, highly recommend doing so. Well, look, like I said, the reason we had them on, are having them on the show, we've decided to dedicate this episode to Halloween as told by Uncle Walt through various media, be it the park, television. The Wonderful World of Disney had a number of programs that would come out, animation. Let's kick it up to the satellite. Karen, what is something that you recently watched, didn't think you'd watch otherwise, or maybe visited after many, many years of not having seen before?
Well, something I just watched the other night, and this was because doing some research for the episode, I looked over the museum's website and was looking at some of the stuff that you guys have in in the site, and especially for the I think it was for the haunted Halloween uh, tour or event. And I know I've seen it many years ago, but I hadn't seen it in a long time. And this was the Skeleton Dance cartoon. I think it was the first Silly Symphony cartoon from like 1929. And this thing it's almost 100 years old, but it still is so brilliant the way that it's put together, the all the sounds and the music and the imagery. I mean, it has all of those things we think about for Halloween. The skeletons are obvious, but then it has, the bats and the spider and all that stuff. And I just wondered if you guys had some thoughts on that, or have any little tidbits that you'd like to share with the listeners on it.
Sure. Well, if as a little aside, if anyone has seen the recent film "Don't Worry, Darling," the TV in the house is playing the Skeleton Dance on a loop, which is I just about squealed in my seat when I saw that. But yeah, I mean, the Skeleton Dance is a really important short in the Disney canon. Obviously, the year before that, Steamboat Willie premiered. So it surprises a lot of people, and it surprised a lot of people at the time that Walt was so interested in jumping into something brand new after he clearly had a hit on his hands, kind of the first signal that maybe the Disney Studios is going to work out after a lot of failures and issues with characters being taken from him. In the case of Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, people were clamoring for more mice. But with the opportunity that Steamboat Willie afforded Walt in his studio, they no longer had the same issue with selling their shorts to theaters. Of course, there's all the Mickey Mouse merchandise that flooded the market, especially in the early 30s, which became such a huge, important flow of cash for the studio. But for everyone seeing that Walt not only wanted to continue making Mickey Mouse shorts, but saw that as his opportunity to diversify, to really test what could be done in animation, how they could push the artistic boundaries of the medium and make just better and better stories. So that kind of started with the Silly Symphonies. And funny enough, the start of the Skeleton Dance was actually pitched by their in-house composer, Carl Stalling, who would later leave the studio and make a lot of iconic scores for like Warner Brothers and others. But he had pitched the Skeleton Dance as this kind of side story. And then it was almost entirely animated by Ub Iwerks, who then was Walt's right-hand man. It was...
I wanted to jump in really quickly about Carl Stalling, and that when he pitched the idea to Walt, Walt really hadn't fleshed out this idea to do the Silly Symphonies yet. That wasn't a thing just quite yet. And Carl Stalling was really kind of, he didn't love the idea of doing the scores for the Mickey Mouse shorts. And I recently read this kind of letter from Walt about how he was... in the Mickey Mouse shorts, you're following the action. That's what the music is doing. So if Mickey Mouse jumps up, the music has to jump up. And Carl really wanted to kind of figure out scores that were, kind of could be on their own and their own masterpieces, and animation could kind of follow those. And finally, Walt was like, well, Carl might have a good idea, and hence the Skeleton Dance. And that was inspired by Edvard Grieg's March of the Dwarves. So it has this spookiness to it. And even that short really employed a lot of new animation techniques for the time, like interchanging white and black cells, and that gives the effect of lightning strikes across the scene. So kind of adding that eeriness to it. But the perfect balance of kind of spookiness and fun that Walt kind of always was able to kind of balance, other than, I would say, in the Chernobog Night on Bald Mountain sequence in Fantasia. There is not a lot of fun being had in that. That's just scary.
Well, I have fun watching it, I'll tell you. But no, I was always amazed when, since you brought that up, I was always amazed at kind of the Disney style, whether it came to Halloween or villains, or, it could be like the witch from Snow White, or it could be the whale from Pinocchio, where they could take a subject matter that is scary or spooky or creepy, but only take it to a certain point so that it didn't lead to like kids running out of the theater or something. It's like, it's very almost like a family friendly, scary type style. And I was wondering if you could comment on that. Was that something that I assume Walt kind of spearheaded that, but
There's one story that's in our, I believe it's in our galleries, possibly, about the old hag sequence in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and Walt showing it to his daughter Diane, who would have been around 5 at that time. And she was terrified of it and, cried. So he, even though he had a daughter at home, I mean, he was still trying to make sure that these were something adults would also find pretty terrifying. And it was just bordering on the line for children. Because that was, at the end of the day, he wasn't making content or films for children. So that's what I find kind of interesting, that they aren't necessarily dumbed down, but they do hold the line. And that sequence of in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs of the old hag kind of, turning around and being, from the queen to the old hag, and the kind of the climax of it, it's actually a reference to the 1931 Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And that sequence is so mirrored very similarly. So I just think, how interesting that they were drawing on these influences of kind of spookier films of the era.
Yeah, I mean, the evil queen was described in an outline of her character as a mixture between Lady Macbeth and the Big Bad Wolf. So you can you could definitely see how they nailed that one. And when you think of Walt's connection with scaring, with thrill, with horror, it really goes to kind of his filmmaking belief that, like Bree touched on, Walt didn't make movies for kids. He made movies for everyone. He made movies for the whole family. And he felt like you needed to have those elements, even the scary elements, because kids could handle it. Kids could understand it. And if you really look at the history of Disney villains and what makes a Disney villain, I mean, you see it all across the board. You see kind of the outrageous, zany, cartoony villains, and then you see the very, terrifying, menacing villains. And I think you had brought up Pinocchio. I feel like that film is such a perfect example of the spectrum of the Disney villain, because it has so many of all the segments. You start off with Honest John and Gideon, who, are very much comic relief. They're kind of sinister and scheming, but you ultimately don't feel that same kind of fear as you do about Stromboli, who's big and blustery, or about the coachman, who is very kind of menacing and in a professional way that, he really terrifies you because it's he's doing his job. It's kind of scary in itself. And then you have Monstro the whale, who is just this literally inhuman eating machine, that there's no sense in reasoning with Monstro. Monstro is going to do what Monstro is going to do. So you just have this entire spectrum of what is scary and terrifying about the Disney villain, all packaged in one film. So really, Pinocchio is a perfect Halloween movie. Plus, you can scare the kids into acting a little bit better sometimes. Don't want to get turned into donkeys, right?
Well, that's the thing, because obviously I've seen Pinocchio numerous times over the decades and years of my life, but I think if I just saw it as a kid, the scenes with Monstro would basically still be in my mind or still be vivid today. I mean, they're that memorable.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. But the coachman, I mean, that's almost like, don't talk to strangers kind of guy, and I'll tell you that, the trees in the forest from Snow White still freak me out. I mean, you visit Disneyland and go through the ride. It made an impression on you as a child. Walt was, we all agree, way ahead of his time in coming up with these stories and surrounding himself with these teams of artists. You brought up a good point about, there being 4 different villains in the Pinocchio film, kind of like blowing my mind right now. So, but it's, as I think about it, it's like, oh my God, that's so accurate and true. One of the things that really scared me as a kid was the dragon from Sleeping Beauty. that transformation. It was just huge. It's something you wouldn't expect, and there was just fire and danger, and a menace. It was so just outrageous. When Walt was developing that story, I know he was working on the park at that time as well, and it's like the castle kind of appeared in real life before the film opened up. What kind of development went into that story, that dragon? I mean, were there storyboards, or do you guys have any insight in that movie?
The Sleeping Beauty is a really interesting film, and I don't know that much about the concept, but I will say a big concept artist was Ivan Earle, and he created these really abstract pictures and concept art for the dragon and Maleficent. And we did an exhibition on him, the art of Ivan Earle, a couple of years back, and there's a lot of great concept pieces. He does really long ones for all the immaculate scenes in Sleeping Beauty, and he ended up would paint the backgrounds for them. But even with just a couple of strokes of paint, you really get the power of these, the dragon, and we have that wonderful scene of just like inflamed and green flames and the dragon and the prince. So even though I think Walt was still pretty involved in that film would be the most expensive film Disney would make. It took almost, I think, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, over 6 years to make, which is way too long for an animated film. It almost bankrupt the whole guacamole, the whole studio. And so, yeah, Chris, did you have something?
Yeah. So Walt's quote is 6 years and $6 million to make Sleeping Beauty, which, if you know anything about the development of Disneyland happening concurrently, it took $17 million to open Disneyland. So a third of what it took to build Disneyland in 1955 was what it took to produce Sleeping Beauty. And I can add a little bit on Bree's point. Maleficent was designed by Mark Davis, who was one of Walt's 9 old men. We had a small exhibition on Mark Davis, Leading Ladies and Femme Fatales, the art of Mark Davis. And we had some of his Maleficent pieces on display. And, you could really see just how kind of dragon-like her own, like even her in her fairy form, how dragon inspired with the horns and with the way that her robes would kind of flicker out kind of like flames behind her, that it's all kind of part of that design language of making you scared of her just from beginning to end. And something, I mean, that film is one of my favorites, especially of the Waltz era. And part of that is that Maleficent is terrifying for so many reasons, but she doesn't have this, until later films filled in more of her backstory. It seems from the very beginning that she is just bad because she wants to be bad. She doesn't get an invite to the party. She shows up and that is just who she is. And it really just kind of rocks you to the core that she, comes in, she curses Aurora and leaves and just is like biding her time. She's in the background somewhere scheming until she turns 16. So there's just so much about that character that makes her really as terrifying as she is. And a lot of that comes down to Mark Davis's original kind of design language for her. And of course, he was a master of design as well. He did Cruella de Vil for 101 Dalmatians, another terrifying villain, but he also did some heroes and heroines as well. He was also responsible for Princess Aurora's design in Sleeping Beauty, kind of doing double duty there, and also famously designed Tinkerbell for Peter Pan. So he was very, very involved in all that.
And would diversify his career into being an Imagineer at Disneyland and adding a lot of the humor into the Haunted Mansion. So another kind of spookiness. Yeah.
Awesome. We're going to get there too.
Yeah, we'll get to the Haunted Mansion. It's a couple of the other cartoons I looked at. There's one that really kind of stood out for me. I think it was called like Pluto's Judgment. and it was like Pluto being a cat chaser. Basically has a dream where he essentially goes to hell, and he faces a jury of cats and a cat that's a prosecutor, and of course he's found guilty. And that has a lot of pretty heavy imagery in there, and a lot of kind of scary moments, if you're a younger child. Do you have any comments on that, or any background on that cartoon?
Not a whole lot of background, but you could tell that hell was certainly not off limits. You see Night on Bald Mountain, and you see Chernabog and all of his little devotees, and they're dancing in this fire, this blaze, which is very, very hellish. And then, of course, you've got Cruella de Vil, who lives in Hell Hall. You have Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, another favorite of all of ours, where you end up literally in hell with the judge that sentences him as well. So very, very, and it's not even in the film either, just a complete invention for the Disney park attraction. So you can tell that, this sense of eternal judgment and hell that had been part of the culture, the predominant culture, was certainly something that even in family films could be something that was used to scare or to tease, that made it all the more terrifying.
Yeah, definitely. Bob, I don't know if you got around to watching the Scarecrow of Romney Marsh. I think, Karen, you were able to.
I saw a very bad looking version on YouTube.
Yeah, it was very hard to find. I do vividly remember it from being on the Magical World of Disney back when I was a kid.
World of Disney, right?
And I know around Halloween they would usually show that. So I remember it as a kid, but I haven't seen that probably in 40 years.
Yeah, we were talking about things to watch, and Karen had made mention. I forgot about it. Honestly, I probably saw it when it came out on one of the.
I only brought it up because a few years ago I had been spending some time on a message board that was mostly devoted to interests in like horror and monster films. But there was a section on Disney, and one of the things that people just raved over was Scarecrow of Romney Marsh. They just loved that film, and I had never seen it. And it is extremely hard to get a hold of. And so I mentioned it to the guys, and so then it was like, where can we find it? Where can we find it?
I will find it someday, I'm telling you. I will find it.
I was fortunate to find a DVD, might be Blu-ray, but I think it's DVD online, and so I was able to check that out. And it's a lot like Robin Hood, but that mask. And the thing that I love too is, here's Walt, and it was almost reminiscent to me of the Night Gallery, because he like reaches over and grabs the book and is like, well, let me talk about this book that I like, and he shares it with us, and then we get into the story, and he had the Scarecrow masks on his desk. There were like 2 or 3 of them on there, and as a kid, it's very, again, he was great at these visions of not horror but spooky, scary things, and these masks fit that, at least for me. And the story was fun. It's a good story if any of our listeners have a chance to find it. Bob's always talking about getting a hold of physical media, because someday the cloud may go away. So but
definitely a fan of physical media. But do you guys know anything about that film, or are the rights tied up somewhere, or is that it's also the film that they never did any kind of Disney attraction on? It's never really been a part of the Disneyland.
Yeah, I don't know of. I'll have to do some digging myself, because I think with Brie as well, the live act, especially like the later, like the 50s, 60s live action, can be a little bit of a spot for us, just because we have so much interest at the museum around the animated films. So that's where a lot of our programming stems from, but would certainly love to get a lot more into the live action films.
Yeah, I guess back then it was Buena Vista did most of the live action.
Yeah, and
releases, I believe.
my understanding is I was just happened to be looking at the list. But Walt Disney actually owned a lot of the live actions for his personal enterprise, Retlaw.
Mhm.
And so I know that those were sold back eventually, but sometimes I'm like, is that a reason why maybe we don't get those? But I think a big part of it is I know on Disney Plus, if there's a spot to recommend what you want to see, so there's a form, and so if there's something that you want to see on there, like a lot of these live actions, I think it has to do with demand, what they're willing to put up if there's actually going to be a demand. So I think a lot of people requested it.
Yeah,
all the listeners need to go on Disney Plus when we're done here and go and request it. It's also known as like Dr. Sin, right? Like SYN.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do think that Walt's interest in kind of spookiness is kind of fun. I do love in their workplace, they had a place called the Morgue. And the Morgue was it was deep within. They had this underground tunnel that connected the animation, the ink and paint, and the animation department. And the morgue, it really looks like it could be a real morgue. It's definitely very spooky down there. And that was where they housed all of their archived animation. That was their animation archive. And so that eventually it got taken out of kind of that room and is in a real archive now, their animation research library. But he did, Walt did, I don't know, it must be a video, but I see a lot of these photos of him kind of joking with the sign of the morgue and like, ooh, spookiness. And really it's just, Mickey Mouse and lots of fun to be had inside the morgue, but it's where animation goes to die.
He even teased it in an episode of the Disneyland TV show too. He gave a comical tour of the morgue where, the opening shot of the episode has the lights off and suddenly you see the large table with the white sheet draped over it, just like a real mortuary. And of course, Walt, ever the prankster, when he removed the sheet, it was just old animation artwork.
That's cool. Another, well, so the Scarecrow of Romney Marsh was part of the TV show. I think it was released theatrically in Europe, but I don't know that it was released here theatrically. I think it was on TV, and there was like 3 parts.
Right.
But the other thing that I watched again, because there was a witch, so Halloween, Walt Disney, Bedknobs and Broomsticks, which I absolutely love and adore that movie. If listeners or the guys here on the podcast, if you have not seen Bedknobs and Broomsticks, and how timely, unfortunately, we recently lost Angela Lansbury, and she does such a wonderful job in that film, and in researching it turns out that Walt was having trouble with the Mary Poppins rights, and so then he talked to the person involved with Bedknobs and Broomsticks, and there were 2 books actually, so they were working on that. Then he had the Sherman Brothers working on music, and there was actually a song that was going to be in Mary Poppins, The Briny Sea, that wound up in Bedknobs and Broomsticks, and it fit a lot better. That would have been a fun ride at Disneyland, jump on that bed and go scooting around the countryside of England. They had, it reminded me of the Invisible Man, the men in armor and the soldiers and the horses, and man, I think it won an Academy Award. Maybe it was a soccer sequence, but there was live action, there was animation. They bridged the live action and animation, which kind of harkened back to one of Walt's original cartoons. Oh God, I can't think of the little girl's name.
Alice, Virginia Davis first played her, but the Alice comedies.
Yeah, and there were a couple of them, and actually they're showcased in a part of the museum. I know as we start, they show some of the vignettes. Yeah, anyway, that was just a lot of fun. I know it's a live action, so you guys might not have a lot of insight into that, but I just had to mention Bedknobs and Broomsticks.
We were talking also about Walt being ahead of his time. I was watching one Lonesome Ghosts cartoon.
Oh yeah,
where basically Mickey, Donald, and Goofy are Ghostbusters before there was any Ghostbusters. I guess they were ghost exterminators, I think they were. Do you guys have anything on
they
that,
needed to deboo
But the ghosts actually called them out because they were haunting this place and they were lonely, and they looked them up in the phone book and called them out just to have fun with them. But
Well, for the Lonesome Ghost, actually, it's interesting. It's particularly noteworthy that the staff at Disney Animation invented transparent paint to actually portray the ghostly apparitions, and it's definitely very effective. It reminds me a lot of, the Pepper's Ghost effects, from animation to live action, or real life, I should say. They're not live action. But, just kind of very similar effects of like portraying ghosts, which I love. Yeah. Always pushing the boundaries at Disney Animation.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah. Well, I know if anyone goes to the museum, I think one of my favorite attractions there is the multi-plane rig that they have there. Is basically they can put cells, well, I guess it was probably glass, on different planes. And so basically when they zoom in on one plate, they can actually zoom through the glass to the next one, and you have like amazing depth. And maybe you can talk about like what films those were used on, or how that developed.
Sure. Well, it wasn't used on all of the films because it was more of a specialty shot that they would use specifically when they needed to achieve that illusion of depth. So it first was used on 1937's The Old Mill, which itself is a pretty spooky film as well.
Right.
The storm hits this windmill, and you see, the gears inside moving and snapping rope, and you see the owls and the creatures that live in the little pond there reacting to this storm. Very, very good film. So the multiplane camera was first used on that. That's also the same year as Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, to give a sense of the timeline. And then
Chris, that is a wonderful deep cut. I did not have a chance to watch that, but I remember that cartoon. Just chef's kiss.
Yeah. And if you see World of Color at Disney's California Adventure, they have a little Old Mill segment in there. So something to keep an eye out. It's part of a larger montage, but there's definitely a dedicated Old Mill section. So keep an eye out for that. So the multiplane camera was used. It was used really effectively on Pinocchio in the one of the opening sequences where you pan in to the whole village and you go through several levels. These shots were expensive to do and took, dozens of artists, technicians to operate this thing and to get those shots that they needed. It ended up, of course, bumping up the cost of these productions. And of course, they would use the multiplane camera in pretty much all their features. And it would bump up the cost. And, with World War II and the effects on international markets, it made those films a lot harder to succeed in their original run, but it also kind of made them timeless, to be able to achieve that effect. And you can see it now that those films stand up. They would use the multiplane camera all the way through, in various effects until 1989's The Little Mermaid. That was the last film to use the multiplane camera. The very next film, The Rescuers Down Under, another personal family favorite of mine, was made completely digitally, completely on computers. And from then on, that 1990 film on, all made on computers. So from 1937 with The Old Mill through 1989 with The Little Mermaid, the multiplane camera was quite literally state of the art.
Chris, I would have thought for sure they used that in Beauty and the Beast, that opening.
Sure. Yeah. Well, they were able to finally achieve using computers those same kinds of effects. But yeah, you can definitely see all the multiplane influences on especially the ballroom scene with again the late Angela Lansbury singing Beauty and the Beast. Just an iconic shot that will always be associated with that film. Very multiplane like, but might have been planned. While they were planning the film, could have been planned with the multiplane camera in mind, and then they, made the transition to computers and were able to replicate it. That's up in the air. That's more than I know personally, but it would stand to reason that they were planning it just like any other feature, because that was very soon after after they made the switch to digital.
Right.
See, now
right.
everyone's gonna have to go back and watch the Disney films and look for those multiplane scenes and try to pick them out.
Not a problem, my friend.
Because I want to say, if I'm picturing scenes and stuff, I'm thinking that they probably used it in Peter Pan for a lot of the flights over the
for the
city,
panning
over
shots, the
London,
tracking shots,
or even Jungle Book, some of the jungle scenes in that. So
absolutely.
Very cool.
I just always think of the patience. Every time I see a multiplane scene and I look at our multiplane camera in our galleries, I'm like, the patience it would have to take to do, the one, it's what, 24
frames per second.
Frames per second.
Yep.
And then moving, and then the backgrounds. I mean, there's so many moving parts on a multiplane scene. And that's why the scene in Pinocchio, I mean, they say it's the most perfect scene in animation ever made amongst animation historians, because it's just all of the background, the people are moving throughout the town, and the birds flying and the bells ringing. I mean, the patience and the artistry that it had to take to create just one of these multiplane scenes is remarkable.
Yeah, you're moving these panels individually. You have people climbing up ladders to get to the top of this thing to film each individual frame, and you've got these wheels on the side that you're using to move it left, right, up, down, and you had to get that all perfectly aligned for the shot that you wanted. It's just it blows my mind just thinking about it.
Totally. I mean,
well, just designing it to, okay, we need this panel is going to have this painted on it, that panel is going to have that, and then obviously you have to picture one wider than the other, whatever, just get everything set up before you can even start shooting.
Absolutely. So guys, before we run out of time, I want to talk about the Haunted Mansion. I know all the parks have a version of a Haunted Mansion, but Disneyland was the first. Straight away, let me just kick it to you guys. I mean, what insight in the history? I know when the New Orleans Square was proposed, they focused a lot of time and effort on pirates, and there was a bit of a delay. And unfortunately, Walt didn't live to see the opening of the Haunted Mansion, but I know he really had a hand in it. So please take it away.
Yeah. To kick it off, before that, to go all the way back before Disneyland was even created, Walt always had a vision of a haunted mansion. In the earliest iterations, in 1952, so Disneyland was debuted in 1955. So in 1952, he asked an artist, Harper Goff, to create the first illustration of a haunted house. And Walt said he wanted to include a haunted house somewhere off of Main Street. And even in later iterations of this park design, artist Herb Ryman also included a kind of creepy little haunted house at the edge of Main Street. And the kind of thought behind it was Walt was thinking of his hometown of Marceline, Missouri, but kind of these old small towns, they always have that one creepy house that the kids kind of run past, and that kind of thought. So Walt knew that there needed to be a haunted house included in his park, and so it would be much later, down in 1963, that a mansion was erected at Disneyland, and it was what is going to be in there. But Walt was pretty insistent that he didn't want a dilapidated spooky house to kind of deteriorate the look of Disneyland. He wanted Disneyland to look amazing, and having some kind of cobwebbed house just didn't quite fit the scene of New Orleans Square. So, and that's why we have this beautiful mansion, and then on the inside is where the spooky haunts are in there. And I do love how Walt, before the attraction was even completed, and Walt passed away before the attraction would debut. But he was talking about that, Disney's Ghost Relations Department are accepting applications for from ghosts wishing to enjoy their, quote, active retirement in a country club atmosphere. So that was the happy haunting grounds that he was hoping to have at Disneyland.
That's awesome.
And I think too, if you think about kind of the legacy of the Haunted Mansion, it also shows how Imagineering was going to proceed post-Walt as well. I mean, if you look at the Haunted Mansion, like Bree was talking about in its earliest concepts, you have Harper Goff, you have Ken Anderson, you have Marvin Davis, all giving like a little bit of a take of what this haunted house at the end of Main Street could look like. And then once it really starts going in the 60s, you have Mark Davis, Rolly Crump, Claude Coates, Yale Gracie. You have all these, I mean, real big Imagineering heavy hitters that are all giving their own kind of twist on what they believe should be inside. And kind of as this master conductor of talent, Walt never explicitly says that, at least as far as I've researched, he never explicitly says that he's going to go in one way or the other. He's just inspired. He's pulling everybody's best work. And of course, at the end, you see that it's very much this team effort of, you know, the scary bits that were very much Claude Coates, the dark comedy of Mark Davis, the optical illusions and weirdness of Rolly Crump, all together in this one now signature marquee, can't have a Disney park without it kind of attraction. So Walt was very much kind of pollinating and kind of inspiring everyone to keep pushing what they were giving forward. And then as Walt passed, you know, when they had those conversations of, oh, what's Imagineering going to be like? It just continued to be that kind of team atmosphere where everyone's putting in.
Right.
So it's very much that, like, you know, if you were to look at Imagineering post Walt, the Haunted Mansion is really kind of that case study.
Yeah, that's one of the first things they did post Walt, right? To finish that off. I mean, he was involved prior, but they executed and opened after his passing.
And
Well,
I mean,
that's-
who's to say what it would have looked like if it did open in the 50s? I mean,
Right.
two of the major elements that are in that attraction are audio animatronics, which debuted in 1963's Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room and continued to expand through the World's Fair with Great Moments of Mr. Lincoln, It's a Small World, Carousel of Progress, Ford's Magic Skyway. But another big thing that was put into the Haunted Mansion in the 60s, also part of the World's Fair, is the Omnimover technology, you know, the Doom buggies.
Got
You
it.
know, that would not have been in a 50s Haunted Mansion because the technology wasn't there yet. They hadn't developed that technology to be able to kind of independently move you around a scene so that the vehicle itself is a character that's showing you what you need to see around the room. So it's very much also that story of the development of storytelling and Imagineering technology too, that take you all the way through to what we know today, you know, in 1969's Haunted Mansion that Walt, of course, didn't live to see open.
Right.
Yeah, the two amazing. I mean, that's usually the first ride I head towards, but
You're not alone in that.
yeah. Although
I'm
now they got
lazy, I
that.
get on
Now
the
they got
train.
Star Wars Land. I'm going to be dragged over there first. But two things that always hit me about the Haunted Mansion was basically the narration at the beginning by Paul Frees,
Oh
and
yeah.
then also Grim Grinning Ghosts
Mhm.
with Thurl Ravenscroft. Both of those, it's always stick in my head. And I think there were some other narrations for the other Haunted Mansions. Maybe, yeah, I think Vincent Price did one, and then there's one in French and one in Japanese and whatever. But yeah, I'm like a big Japanese movie fan. So I just remember Paul Frees and his voices in all the old dubbed Godzilla films and stuff. And then to hear his voice in the Haunted Mansion, you know, but realizing that's Boris Badenoff, like welcoming you into the mansion. But do you have any background on how those two gentlemen were selected or brought in to do their parts?
Well, Paul Frees he did lent his voice a lot in Disneyland. So he was, I'm trying to think, I don't have it pulled up, but he was a very popular guy in lending his voice. So he had a great instrument that was kind of perfect for this. In terms of the song Grim Grinning Ghosts, that was developed by Xavier Atencio, who also wrote Pirates of the Caribbean song Yo Ho Yo Ho, A Pirate's Life for Me. So I always love that kind of fun fact.
That is cool.
And he had never written a script before his experience writing those songs and contributing to the script for Pirates of the Caribbean and Haunted Mansion. That Walt, in kind of a classic Walt story, Walt just approached him with it, and X said that, I've never done this before, and Walt just gave him well, I think you can do it, and
That was the time.
just let him, pushed him, gave him the support he needed, and said, I think you would do well with this. And I mean, those songs, just in terms of the wordplay involved, they're just such rich songs. There's such good storytelling going on in those too, that really take you on an adventure as much as the attractions do themselves. So yeah, it all comes back to exitentio and not wanting to say no to the boss, even if you're as scared as some of the kids riding the attraction would be.
Well, that's the thing. If your doom buggy is going to break down, you want it to break down right by the tombstone so you can hear the whole song. Mm-hmm. But if you look on YouTube, if you look up Grim Grinning Ghosts on YouTube, there's actually a video on there, or film, whatever, of the faces from the tombstones, like the actors' faces against a black background, and you can see them like acting out the different parts of the song just with facial expressions. And it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I wanted to tie back when I said I couldn't find my notes about Paul Frees. Fun fact, we've been talking so much about the Disneyland TV show and Wonderful World of Color. Mm-hmm. He voiced Ludwig von Drake.
He did.
Donald Duck's uncle, nutty professor. And he also does a lot of did some voices in Pirates of the Caribbean, and is the narrator of Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln. So just kind of some of the ways that his voice has been sprinkled in, as well as it's not there anymore, but Adventures Through Inner Space as well. So yeah.
That's a good
that's fact. Great. Now I know, like, these days you go to Disneyland during Halloween and it's this big thing, and they've got a haunted mansion all decked out like Nightmare Before Christmas, and pumpkins all along Market, Main Street and all that. What was it like back in, let's say, Walt's days, early to mid 60s? Halloween would come around. Was there anything added to the park, or any, throw some cobwebs up, or what did they do?
Halloween certainly wasn't the industry it is today, which is something to keep in mind. The first event really resembling Halloween happened on Halloween 1959. So during Walt's time, they had a parade of the pumpkins, and they had kids dressed up in Halloween costumes. There are also photos of kids gathered in Holidayland, which was kind of the picnic area of the park that, of course, doesn't exist anymore, where they would carve pumpkins and such. But, as the years went on through the 60s and the 70s, and as Halloween was getting bigger and more popular, there was definitely this kind of struggle of how are we going to make this holiday fit with our operation. Obviously, through Walt's lifetime, they had the big two holidays a year, Christmas and Easter, where they would regularly do special events. But with Halloween, obviously, you don't want adults coming in and with costumes, with masks, where there's potentially safety and security issues going on. So their celebrations were much more low key. They brought some Halloween type programming to Walt Disney World when it opened in the early 70s. It opened in 71, but I think more 72 was the first Halloween event they had there. But then, what we think of today as the modern standard for Disney Halloween programming, the ticketed Halloween party, that didn't start at Disneyland until the mid 90s. So it's fair to say that what we know as Disneyland, Disney Parks Halloween events didn't really resemble what they were doing in Walt's time, and is certainly much more of a recent modern invention.
Well, I think one advantage back in Walt's time is you did have, like, every Sunday night was the Magical World of Disney or the Wonderful World of Disney. So you had that every single week, because you couldn't, like, I want to watch Pinocchio tonight, pop it into the VCR and go for it. It's like you had to wait for these things to be re-released, or you had to wait for them to come on TV, or you had to wait for whatever. But you had, Walt on TV every week, and it all tied into Disneyland. And so as a kid, it's almost like you're totally involved in the whole thing, between the movies and the show and the park. And I know now kids are probably involved in it because they stream everything and then go to the park. But
Sure.
I don't know. It seemed a little more special back then.
Well, and that was part of the genius of Walt getting involved in TV. I mean, Walt had been hounded for the TV rights to his content since, I believe, the 30s, like well before TV was, massively available. Walt was, asked in certain contracts to sign off the television rights to his movies. And Walt really didn't know what television was going to be, but knew that if it was that valuable that people were asking about them, that maybe he should hold on to them. And then, of course, with wanting to open Disneyland, needing some extra funding, Walt would, of course, make it a stipulation of whatever entity he sold his television rights to, they would also have to invest in Disneyland. And then it became this thing where, ABC becomes the first channel to show Disney programming, has the show on Sunday nights, and Walt can just go directly to the people. And obviously 3 channels at the time, not a whole lot of competition.
Right.
Families could watch all together. So Walt really could then use that new medium of television to give directly to the people his new project that was going to be so exciting that they all needed to drive to fly to take the whole family to, and that every week he could tease out either something that was definitively going into his parks or a story from a land, right? Like watching Davy Crockett, out of Frontierland, watching the Man in Space series for Tomorrowland. Sometimes they would chop up like Alice in Wonderland and show that as part of the Fantasyland segments of the show. Various things that he could say, all of these live at Disneyland, and Disneyland is a real place. You should come visit. So it was just all kind of tied up in that ecosystem that he was able to create, which was another way that he was so ahead of his time.
Absolutely. Come see the Mouseketeers. They're at Disneyland this weekend. What?
Right, they were literally there performing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So one of the things I find interesting, Walt's going to work on a program, a show about Mount Matterhorn. Well, let's put the Matterhorn in the park, and by God, he did. Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan. He was able to. He was an entertainer. He was creator, but he was a businessman as well. That Sleeping Beauty castle is iconic. That is, the first thing you see in Disneyland walking down Main Street. I thought it was interesting. Decades later, they do the Pirates movie, with Johnny Depp, but they never did anything around. Well, the Haunted Mansion. They tried the Eddie Murphy, and recently I watched the Muppets, which, if you guys haven't seen, is charming. Around the Haunted Mansion, I felt a bold move for Walt to say, this isn't around a movie or a show. I want a Haunted Mansion in Disneyland. You guys, well, viewers, you can't see my office, but I have all this flotsam and jetsam on my wall. I'm a baby Walt. I could put whatever. Walt could put whatever in a park. I want a carousel. Bam, he'd put a carousel. I want a Haunted Mansion. I want pirates. I mean, the man was amazing. Do you guys have any insight on why he didn't do like a wonderful? Well, he did, I guess, with the Osmonds, and Kurt Russell toured the Haunted Mansion. I remember watching that, but there was no real movie or anything like that around the Haunted Mansion. Just any idea why that didn't happen? Or
well, the attraction wasn't settled during Walt's lifetime. I mean, the idea, it hadn't been settled by the time that he died, and it wouldn't be another 4 years until the attraction actually opened. Right. So, and famously, they say about the development of the Haunted Mansion attraction, there was so many cooks in the kitchen. Yeah. And I mean, the attraction went through so many iterations. It was going to be a walkthrough. At one point, it was thrown out to be a water ride where you'd float through, the Louisiana plantations. So there was a lot of different iterations that the Haunted Mansion went through. And it kind of sounds like, based on all the research that's been shown about the development, it's like Walt didn't have a clear idea to develop content around it. But yeah, It's interesting.
Yeah, initially I thought you were going to say that you would ride the rapids through the mansion. Oh, there's a ghost. There's a skeleton. Oh.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, look, we're coming towards the end of the podcast. Any last thoughts or comments or anything you want to make before we get into our censor sweep?
The only thing I wanted to bring up, and I know I brought it up in an email. I don't think anyone knew much about it, but when I was growing up anyway, there was the LP, the Thrilling, Chilling Sounds of the Haunted House, which I kind of looked up a little bit. It came out in 1964 with like a white cover, and it came out again in 73 with the orange cover. I actually have the white cover down in my basement somewhere, but side one was like 10 stories. And I guess they were narrated by Laura Olsher, Olsher. And then side two was like 10 tracks of just sound effects. But all the sound effects in the album were all from like the Disney library. And just quick aside, when I was a kid, I was handing Halloween candy out on the porch, and I had that record playing. And on the second side, there's a whole track of just like cats fighting. And somebody pulled up in a pickup, and they had a Great Dane in the back of the pickup, and he just jumped out of the truck and started running up my stairs. I'm like, turn it off. But no, it's an iconic album for oldsters like me. I guess it came out on Disneyland Records. And like I say, all the sound effects and all that came from the Disney library, from all the films and shows that they had done. And
what's interesting about that record is that was most people's first time experiencing the Haunted Mansion. And the attraction hadn't come out yet. And for a lot of people, I listened to a couple of interviews, but I believe one aspect of that LP, there is a ghost host narration. Is that
something like that?
Yeah, and it was narrated by Pete Renaday. And so for a lot of people, they associate that particular voice on that LP as being their version of the ghost host, versus Paul Frees's version of the ghost host, who would later do the narration of the Haunted Mansion attraction. So I love that. I don't know a ton about it. I've listened to more interviews about it, but I love how that's, most people kind of had those spooky and thrilling, creepy sounds of the Haunted Mansion.
Well, I think any kid that had their house decorated for Halloween and all that, they would put that on, as kids walked up to the door.
Sure.
But,
Cool.
I know there was one, if people go out and listen to this album, I know there's one track on side one that's very un-PC, I guess, called The Chinese Water Torture. So if it was ever re-released, I'm sure that track would not be on there, but
maybe just name something else.
Yeah.
I'd kick myself if I didn't mention Ichabod Crane and the Headless Horseman.
Yes, we haven't talked about that one. I love the Legend of the Sleepy Hollow.
Yes. We kind of touched on Mr. Toad's ride. But please, could you give us a little bit of
that's another
background
great
insights?
song too in there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And it was sang by Bing Crosby. And Bing Crosby offered the narration of the film. So I just love when they bring in kind of these more popular artists of the time. In that era in particular, they had lots of different singers and songwriters come in on these package features. And this would be the last package feature. And the story is based on Washington Irvine's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And that was first published in England in 1820. Walt actually visited the area of Tarrytown on the Hudson River of New York to do research for this particular film. And the filmmakers put in a lot of research for colonial period ties to make sure the film was portrayed, had historical accuracy to it.
That's cool.
So I just love the action. I believe, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, that the Headless Horseman was animated by one of Walt Disney's 9 old men, Woolly Reitherman. And there's just great horse animation. It's definitely very, very thrilling. Chris, did you have any fun facts about it?
Not anything more than you've covered. There isn't really enough written about the Legend of Sleepy Hollow or about the Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. respectively. But it's such a fun twin bill. Like, you were mentioning it was the last of the package features. The package features kind of come out of the World War II, creating these segments to use to give their animators some work, and also to be able to put things together that were too long to be considered shorts, too short to be considered features. So this was kind of a result of that, and it's probably one of the most well-known of the time period. But you think, what is it really that combines? What is it that ties these two stories together? Not a whole lot, despite the areas, the eras that they come from. But even then, it's a bit of a stretch. But they're just such fun, wild rides, and they do involve a lot of Walt's very core animators that would design all these famous characters that we know and love today, and also would be there. Most of them would still be there as Walt passed and as they were taking the direction of the studio into the future. So it's one of those where they're all together and they're all working on some character in either of these stories, and it's just a treat for an animation historian to watch.
That's very cool. Listeners, I'm gonna have Karen post a picture, but I'll show you guys. I am a huge fan of the Headless Horseman. This is an ornament that came out a couple of years ago of the Headless Horseman on his horse with the sword. I love that. Well, I love Mr. Toad too, actually. But
that segment in particular, I don't really necessarily care for Ichabod. But the Headless Horseman, I mean, that whole sequence is just absolutely terrifying. There really isn't a ton of humor embedded in it, other than the fact that Ichabod gets away. Like, that is the most like, oh, okay.
Well, the Headless Horseman laughs, so there's humor in it.
Well,
he's laughing.
He finds a lot of humor in it.
Well, he throws that pumpkin head towards the camera, and that comes out at you. That's great.
Well, the beauty of the ending is it's ambiguous. They say, well, there's legend that Ichabod married and had children, and they show, a potential Ichabod, but maybe he didn't. Maybe that was just the narration. So
I've never heard that theory before. I like that.
Spooky. So
that's funny.
Well, look, guys, this is the point in the podcast where we usually have our censor sweep, but we have guests on today, and please, Bree and Chris, feel free to come back to Planet 8 anytime you like.
Of course.
We most certainly will keep your information handy, but give our listeners a little more information on what's happening at the museum. Tell us a little more about your podcast. Where can we find you? Where can we hear you?
Yeah, you can find WDFM, the official Walt Disney Family Museum podcast, wherever you find your podcasts. We also post our video version of our podcast that's available with all the closed captioning and show notes. We post that on our YouTube channel at WDF Museum. And you can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at that same handle. So, yeah.
And then currently what's happening at the museum, we have one special exhibition that's currently open and one that is soon to open. Right now we have Walt Disney's The Jungle Book Making a Masterpiece, which is a deep dive into everything about producing 1967's The Jungle Book, which was the last animated feature film that Walt personally produced, personally supervised. It was curated by one of our good friends, Andreas Deja, who famously was the key supervising animator on Jafar in Aladdin, Scar in The Lion King, Gaston and Beauty and the Beast, Lilo, and many others. And he also has a very large collection of animation artwork. He's very passionate about sharing the history that got him inspired to be an animator. Watching The Jungle Book in particular inspired him to start along this path. So he's always felt like the story of how The Jungle Book came to be, and the impact of Walt's passing and kind of its legacy today were all really important to tell. So that special exhibition is in our Diane Disney Miller Special Exhibition Hall, and it'll be running through January 8th, 2023. So still have a couple more months to see that. And upcoming, we have our Spirit of the Season Community Art Exhibition. We solicited some our local and global community to create artworks inspired by what this season of the year upcoming means to them, their family traditions, and also tied it a little bit in with our Jungle Book exhibition. So that will be opening Thursday, November 17th, and will run through the holiday season. So if you're in town, come by, check out both Spirit of the Season, a community art exhibition, and Walt Disney's The Jungle Book, making a masterpiece.
Awesome. Let me ask you for my own personal, will there be another Christmas with Walt little video that's shown in the theater this year?
Good question. Sure. We're still working on what our films through the end of the year are. Okay. But as soon as we get those finalized, they will be up on our website, waltdisney.org, and also waltdisney.org/calendar.
Very good. You know, I'm going to save those URLs, kids. So I've done that program before, and I'd love to do it again. And guys, listeners, if you haven't been to the museum, either online or in person, honestly, you are going to have the time of your life. There's a gift shop as you exit, and a little coffee stand. You know, there's all kinds of stuff you guys can avail yourself there at the museum. It really is a day adventure. They have a bunch of awards and accolades. You guys still have part of Walt's apartment in the front lobby there?
Yeah, we do. We have the original furniture that was in Walt's apartment. We even have the original lamp that was in the window. So we sometimes rotate that furniture out. But so there's a beautiful set up currently in our lobby, and that's free to the public. The awards lobby, you're free to walk through and see all of Walt Disney's Academy Awards, as well. You know, the famous Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs Academy Award. And so, yeah, and we're located in the Presidio of San Francisco. So I don't know if people, but yeah.
And they also have that big tabletop model of Disneyland as it looked back in Walt's day, like in the mid-60s.
That's inside. Yeah, that's down below that. And they have his train is in there. I mean, his personal collection of miniatures. We could do a whole nother episode just on the museum, guys, but
well, you can listen to our podcast where we do go through all the galleries of the museum. And yeah, Walt Disney's our miniature model of Disneyland of Walt's imagination, not one particular period of time, but spans from its inception in 1955 through Walt's death of 1966. And it was designed by Kerner Optical. You spoke about Star Wars Land. The same folks who, kind of developed the special effects for Industrial Light and Magic and Lucasfilm also created our model. So a little touch of a galaxy far, far away.
little side plug, next to the museum down the way is the Yoda fountain with the little statue of Yoda. So you guys, like I say, it's a fun time. There's a bowling alley. Anyway, thank you again, Bree and Chris, for being on the show. We absolutely love and adore you guys. Appreciate the fine work that you're doing on behalf of Walt's legacy. And you guys take care, listeners. It's the end of the podcast. Till next time, peace out.
Have a great Halloween season.
Yes.
On that note, this will conclude this transmission from Planet 8. We would like to thank all of our intergalactic audience for listening. Be sure to head on over to our website at www.planet8podcast.com, where you can get more information on this episode's topic.
For more conversation, find us on Twitter at Planet8Cast.
Or on Facebook at facebook.com/Planet8Podcast.
We want to thank you guys for tuning in each and every episode. We look forward to your input and opinions. Until next time, this is Planet 8 signing off. End transmission.
By George, he's got it. It is the end.